Today is the day. With a jolt of anxious energy, Max grabs her car keys from the cup holder, takes one last sip of coffee, and stops to look at herself in the rearview mirror. In just a few short hours, she imagines how different she'll look. The breasts that symbolize her imprisonment in a female body will be gone. The final chains of binary bondage will be broken. She will be free from the mental agony that has plagued her for years. She steps out of the car, slams her door decisively, and steps into the hospital. Max's story reflects the lives of countless children who struggle with gender dysphoria and feel that if they could receive gender transition treatment, their life would improve significantly. But are such treatments beneficial, safe, and ethical? After extensive research, I've concluded that they are not. My name is Reagan Stallings, and today I will be defending the thesis that gender transition for children should be medically banned. In order to defend my thesis, I will present 3 points. First, that gender reassignment treatments do physical harm. Second, that gender reassignment treatments do psychological damage. And third, that gender reassignment treatment for children is medically unethical. I will then refute 2 counter-arguments against my thesis. First, that puberty blockers are a safe way to treat youth with gender dysphoria while allowing them neutral time to assess their gender. And second, that affirmation benefits children diagnosed with gender dysphoria. In order to best contemplate my arguments, a few definitions must be familiarized. The first of these is gender transition, which is, in my own words, the medical and social effort of an individual to transition from their biological God-given gender to a preferred gender. The second is children. For the purpose of this thesis, when I use the word children, I'm referring to all individuals below the age of 18 who are legally considered minors. The third term is gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is, according to the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, quote, discomfort or distress that is caused by a discrepancy between a person's gender and that person's sex assigned at birth. It's worth noting that the phrase sex assigned at birth is referring to your biological sex. The final thing I'd like to clarify is the term gender. Many people define gender as a social construct while relegating the term sex to biological reality. However, no distinction between these 2 terms is ever made in the Bible, and therefore I will be using the terms interchangeably. My first argument is that gender reassignment treatments do physical harm. One of the primary treatments that doctors prescribe for children with gender dysphoria is puberty blockers, or puberty suppression hormones, like gonadotropin-releasing hormone antagonists, which stunt the production of sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen. The physiological results of such hormone suppression are alarming and include a lack of development of secondary sex characteristics, arrested bone growth, decreased bone accretion, lack of maturation of the brain, and inhibited fertility. In light of the fact that puberty blockers are considered the first step in gender transition treatment, the permanency of such side effects is pretty startling. The next step in treatment is often hormone replacement therapy. Hormone replacement therapy is the administration of testosterone or estrogen to an individual based on which gender they're trying to transition to. For example, a woman in the process of transition is typically given a dose of testosterone between 10 and 40 times her level rate of production. There is indication that such aggressive hormone introduction makes these women 5 times more likely than their peers not receiving treatment to have a heart attack, and twice as likely as men. Additionally, testosterone and estrogen administration has been proven to cause an increased risk of diabetes, stroke, blood clots, cancer, heart disease, and insulin resistance, while also having unknown effects on breast, endometrial, and ovarian tissues for women. It's pretty easy to get lost in this long list of health issues, but I implore you to consider the weight of each of these side effects. They can be excruciatingly painful and even fatal. They can change the trajectory of lives. My second argument is that gender transition treatment is psychologically damaging for children. Something crucial to understand for this is the maturation of the brain. The brain will not reach full maturity until the early 20s, means that a child is primarily utilizing the amygdala, which is responsible for emotion, as opposed to the prefrontal cortex, which would be utilized later, and is responsible for reasoning and higher order cognitive processes. Despite this neurological reality, children who are legally restricted from drinking, smoking, and even voting are being handed the reins in regard to physical treatments and mutilation. In Oregon, for example, the age of medical consent is 15 years old. This means that in the state of Oregon, a freshman in high school can walk into a gender clinic and receive testosterone simply based on informed consent, with no therapy or referral even required. It should be unsurprising that this and other similar policies have dire results. A woman named Kira Bell wrote this for WebMD, quote, "I was an unhappy girl who needed help. Instead, I was treated like an experiment. As I matured, I recognized that gender dysphoria was a symptom of my overall misery, not its cause." The dark reality of mental distress following gender transition treatment is evidenced by a Swedish study that was published in 2011, which illuminated grave outcomes for participants who had received gender transition treatment. Those who had received treatment were found to be 4.2 times more likely than their peers to be hospitalized for psychiatric reasons, 7.6 times more likely to attempt suicide, and over 19 times more likely to complete that suicide. My final argument is that gender reassignment treatment for children is medically unethical. Across the nation, doctors are performing surgeries like double mastectomies and vaginoplasties, even on children who often have various mental illnesses. Dr. Angela Sanford, who founded the Lundstrom Gender Clinic, has said that among her patients, 90% had a mental health diagnosis other than gender dysphoria, and over 80% had 2 or more. Allowing children suffering from mental illness to make decisions of incredible magnitude is not only cruel, it is remarkably reckless. Additionally, the lack of restriction on which doctors can perform surgeries like phalloplasty, which is the artificial construction of male genitals, is absurd, dangerous, and a breeding ground for medical malpractice. One transgender individual named Blake described her experience with phalloplasty as a devastating event. Skin was removed from her arm to construct the penile shaft, which unfortunately led to lifelong pain and handicap. Additionally, she developed sepsis in her urethra due to hair developing on the inside of the skin flap that had been removed. It was incredibly painful and ultimately caused her urethra to fail, which rendered the entire surgery futile. With this in mind, it's startling that there is no legislation in place requiring that patients be informed of these risks that are associated with gender transition treatment. This means that informed consent, which is a term often used to describe protocol, is not regulated or even defined in the medical community. Finally, gender transition is the only sphere of medical treatment where it is acceptable for the destruction of a body part's function to be intentionally and unnecessarily caused by a doctor. Imagine a person desires to be blue-eyed, and you decide the best way to accomplish this is to gouge out both of their eyes and to give them 2 glass blue eyes. They now have blue eyes, technically, but they don't work. They can't see. You've robbed them of the capacity of vision. The first argument that I will be refuting is that puberty blockers are a safe way to treat youth with gender dysphoria while allowing them neutral time to assess their gender. Many people believe that puberty blockers are simply a pause button on sexual development and therefore would allow more time for children with gender dysphoria to decide that gender transition treatment would not be what they should do. However, statistically, this argument falls apart. Recently, a clinical trial was performed in Amsterdam on the first 70 eligible candidates who received puberty suppression. This study found that 100% of the children treated with puberty blockers remained dysphoric and advanced to cross-sex hormones. Considering that approximately 70 to 85% of children grow out of gender dysphoria when no such medical intervention is made, that's a pretty astonishing number. And it likely has a lot to do with the social isolation that those children feel. Once they're held back from sexual maturation, their peers are all moving on, they feel that they must continue with this gender transition treatment. Finally, though puberty blockers are approved for use in the delay of puberty in children with extremely early pubertal onset, the Food and Drug Administration has not approved the use of puberty suppression hormones for children with gender dysphoria. In fact, no large randomized study on such a use for puberty suppression hormones has ever been performed. In a world that claims to value evidence-based medicine, this should give healthcare professionals, families, and society at large great pause. The second argument I'll be refuting is that affirmation benefits children diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Though many feel that affirmation should be the primary goal of every parent and physician, testimony from those who experienced gender dysphoria as a child tells another story. A young woman named Crash began gender transition as an adolescent, but ultimately detransitioned at the age of 27. Now as an adult, this is the message she chooses to share. Quote, "Taking testosterone didn't get to the root of my suffering. It only relieved it temporarily. I came out of my transition with many of the same problems as before, and then some. Being supported in my trans identity didn't help me. Letting go and accepting myself as a woman did. Changing my body didn't help me find lasting peace. I helped myself by tracing back my trans identity and dysphoria to trauma and working through how I'd been hurt." End quote. With this in mind, is affirmation of a child's perceived gender identity truly humane? No, it's not. In the crucial and confusing time while their brains are still developing, teaching and counseling are the best ways to holistically treat the mental struggles that children are facing. Some of the most helpful resources in my research were two books. The first of which was Irreversible Damage, written by Abigail Schreier, and the second is When Harry Became Sally by Ryan T. Anderson. These books were useful because they contained a vast array of information, including studies and statistics, testimonies, and scientific definitions. I also found articles in various journals, such as the Cambridge University Press and the online Journal of Health Ethics, to be of much use, as they were rich with data and observations from medical professionals. Of my sources, the least helpful was the World Professional Association for Transgender Health's Standards of Care, purely because it advocates strongly against my thesis and therefore was used mainly to bolster my reputation. I was motivated to frame my thesis around the issue of gender transition for children because I witnessed in real time the rise of the gender identity crisis permeating our youth. Children are less sure than ever of who they are because ultimately they're less aware of whose they are. That is the crux of this matter, and that is what inspired me. As I performed my research, the two things that stood out to me the most were the severity of physical complications from gender transition treatment and the lack of regulation or care regarding this issue in the medical community. These two factors create a dangerous precipice for medical ethics, and as someone who is interested in entering the medical field, that concerns me greatly. Additionally, the issue of gender transition for children is one with overwhelming biblical relevancy. Ecclesiastes 1, 9 through 10 says, "What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, 'See, this is new'? It has been already in the ages before us." Though gender transition for children seems like a fairly new phenomenon, it is a manifestation of the striving for identity that has plagued humanity since the fall. The Israelites built idols and searched far and wide for something that would reveal to them their truth. However, their efforts were ultimately futile. Human beings cannot effectively construct identity and purpose apart from God. He is the author of our story and has detailed each facet of our character, including our gender. Like Max, thousands of children are questioning at this very moment who they are. Was there a mistake in their creation? In a world that is telling children that they need to tear themselves apart to be complete, it is crucial we share that wholeness can only be found in Christ. As Christians, there are many ways we can stand for our children. One is by requiring sound education on the biological and biblical framework for sex. This means that we must vote for school board members who will defend the teaching of biology and the distinction of gender in our schools. At home, we must take the time to have meaningful conversations with our children about how the bodies we possess are masterpieces that God has created with a specific purpose. We must place boundaries around social media use and monitor digital education, as the headquarters for the transgender movement are on Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok. In age-appropriate terms, we must teach our children about their bodies in a loving manner before social media and Google teach them fragmented versions of such lessons. As the church, we must resist the temptation to sweep the current cultural storm under the welcome mat, and instead preach clearly about God's design for his children and their gender. Finally, we must vote for politicians who will sign legislation protecting our children and promoting a right view of gender, such as the bill recently passed in Arkansas, which essentially placed a ban on gender transition for children. Ultimately, the greatest step that Christians can make towards the medical ban of gender transition treatment for children is sharing the truth. We must begin by instilling an understanding of identity and purpose in our children. We must also share the truth of gender with non-believers and urge them to join us in the fight for our children's health and safety. It takes a community to raise a child. It takes the nation to save a generation. Thank you. I can take any questions you have this time.
Well, Reagan, I just want to commend you. Reading your paper, it was clear that you are a portrait of what is unique about Summit Christian Academy, that you're able to seek out truth and then articulate it in such a stellar way. And your presentation tonight was no less stellar. So I appreciate all the work and effort and the poise that you had up there. It was really a good presentation. Man, my heart is exactly where yours is. But I wanted to address one specific thing that is a challenge for me, and I wondered what your thoughts were. I am against government coming into the home and making regulations on how I raise my kids. How does this play into that? This is the government coming in and telling me as a parent what I do with my child and what I can and cannot do. What are your thoughts on that?
I would say that with my thesis specifically being about a medical ban, I think it largely pertains to the medical practice of gender transition treatment, puberty suppression, hormones, surgeries, that sort of thing. What you do in your own home, I would assume probably doesn't involve puberty suppression hormones or couldn't, but I'd say that, social transition and that sort of thing is sort of a separate issue from the medical ban on gender transition treatments, which is what I'm largely focusing on, and doesn't really so much involve government intervention as it does medical intervention from the medical community saying, this is where we draw the line on standards and policies for our hospitals and doctors.
Again, I also want to second what John said. I want to just second, excellent presentation, great, well argued, and also compassionately argued from the perspective of what is good for children. How do we, this is not just a culture war thing, this is us caring genuinely to see. So that was communicated clearly. I was just wondering if you could expand for us what, thinking about a parent in the situation where they have a child who is dealing with the difficult experience of gender dysphoria. Could you just help expand what is watching and waiting, and then the counsel, what might that look like? Would you mind expanding on that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that I was looking at a lot in my research is, if all these statistics are saying that gender transition treatment is not the right answer, what is a good answer for these parents who are experiencing, children are struggling with gender dysphoria at rates we've not seen previously. And so one of the things I found that was really interesting is in 2015, a doctor named Kenneth Ducker, he ran a study, and in his study he found that 88% of children who not only you watched and waited, but also received professional counseling that specifically dealt with their individual trauma and what they were working through, 88% of those children outgrew their dysphoria, largely because, as with the testimony from various individuals who had experienced gender transition treatment, a lot of times there's roots and trauma to this that can't be addressed simply with surgery or medical treatments, but really need someone to come alongside as a professional in mental health and walk beside you to get to the root of your trauma that's causing this manifestation of pain and suffering.
I do this would be repetitive. It's hard to come up with clarifying questions for something you 100% agree with. But I'm going to try. So, are there things that we're doing as a church, as a Christian community, that are possibly causing some misunderstanding of our motives? And when it comes to something like this, where you can produce medical evidence that's harming children, but then there are also voices within the church, within the Christian community, that are very pro something like conversion therapy, which also, we've seen that there is some medical, psychological harm there as well. I mean, I know we're talking about extremely different things, and you carved out a very beautiful, I think very clearly defined exception to within a complex issue. But I guess my question is getting at, as Christians, can we be more consistent in our compassion across this issue so that these kinds of things aren't lost? Because I feel like your issue gets lost in a larger conversation we have about how we relate to this community and helping them in their crisis.
Yeah, I think that what you said, and that oftentimes individual issues like this get lost in the larger issue of LGBTQ matters in the church. I think that is certainly something that I witnessed in my research a lot of the time. I think that loving and compassion in the church is key to an issue like this, especially if you're dealing with children. Children's understanding of gender identity and sex at this point is still largely being shaped. And I think that, the most compassionate and loving thing that we can do as Christians is to teach our children the truth in love. So I think that showing them from a biblical framework how we're designed in God's image, and each gender has unique specific facets of God's image as a part of us. I think that teaching that truth is the most loving thing that we can do, and I think that it's important that we don't lose sight of that. I think it's easy to become caught up in the idea that not affirming a child in the way that they're thinking is unloving, but I would argue that in fact the exact opposite is true. Affirming someone, especially a child, in something that is going to ultimately lead to destruction or self-mutilation, at these extremes, would be very unloving, and as Christians we're called to better.